Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History by podcast. And tonight I am joined by Dr. Brad H. Young, and we're going to be talking about Lukan priority. Is the so-called third gospel actually the first gospel of the four, other than being the third? Tonight's discussion will be based on his book titled Jesus and His Jewish Parables, Rediscovering the Roots of Jesus' Teachings. So I'll have the link to that book to be in the description below and the pinned comment if you want to go purchase it, along with the rest of Brad's books as well. That being said, Brad, thank you for joining me tonight.
Well, thank you, Jacob. It's really good to be with you tonight. I might also mention just in passing that the website Jerusalem Perspective is soon to release the digital copy of Jesus and His Jewish Parables, which should be available soon at the Jerusalem Perspective website. They have a bookstore there, and I think it's good we're going to have a digital version out there now.
That's great. So what I'd like to start us off with is this question. Let's recap. For those that don't know who you are, I've never heard of this, never heard of the Jerusalem School hypothesis. I have no idea about any of this. What is the Jerusalem School hypothesis, and what are these documents on the screen here? This is my recreation of the stemma that you have in your book in page 151. What are these texts? The first reconstruction, reorganized source text, Greek translation, Hebrew, or evangelium?
Well, as you were saying in the introduction, many people think of the third gospel as being Luke, and we are reversing that. And if you look at this diagram at the very bottom, you see Matthew, and because it's at the bottom because that's the last gospel to be written. Mark is the next to the last gospel to be written, and the first gospel is Luke. But as you see, we're going up on the ladder. We are investigating the sources behind the gospels. And the earliest source, if you see at the very top, is the Hebrew evangelium. We could just call this the Hebrew gospel. Let me just point out a text that probably a lot of people are familiar with that might help you understand what we're talking about. You think at Holy Communion, Eucharist, often we read from one of Paul's epistles, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and he said on the night that Jesus was betrayed, we received this tradition. And he gives the description of the Last Supper, which was a Passover meal, and the words of Jesus. And it's very similar to the words in Matthew and Luke in particular. And a lot of biblical scholars say that Paul's epistles were written earlier. Corinthians sometimes dated 56. I mean, there's different datings for it. And the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are usually dated maybe 70 CE or a little bit after, a little bit before. There's, of course, different datings. And what I would say is that what we find in Paul's epistles is a reference to these earlier sources. The Greek translation of the Hebrew evangelium, where we have a literal translation of a Hebrew source, which was giving us the story of Jesus' life. And in the way that we discovered it and studied it and really looked at it, especially with our roots in Jerusalem, we had this approach, especially in the days of Professor David Flusser, who was a very important scholar in the comparative religions department at Hebrew University, a great scholar of the Dead Sea Scrolls. He received the Israel Prize for his critical edition of Yosipon. He worked in different areas, and I had the privilege of working with him writing my doctorate under him. My doctorate was on the parables of Jesus. And Flusser had written a book on the parables and has written a lot of articles on the parables of Jesus as well. I also worked with another founding scholar of the Jerusalem School, that was Shmuel Safrai, who worked much more in the rabbinic literature area. But when we start looking at the sources behind the Gospels, we just have to go to Luke's description, because Luke was writing and telling Theophilus, maybe the one who's underwriting this gospel. Luke's gospel is probably the length of a scroll. It includes the birth narratives, the teachings of Jesus, parables, 3 predictions of Christ's death leading up to this final trip to Jerusalem. And of course, it ends with the resurrection and the sending out of the apostles to wait in Jerusalem for the promise of the Father. And it sets the stage for the second document in the New Testament we have from Luke, which is the book of Acts, Acts of the Apostles. It's the history book, and it picks up with the beginnings of the early Christian community and the Jesus movement as it's expanding and growing in the first 3 decades of its beginning. And so when we look at the introduction that Luke gives to his gospel, he says, many have sought to understand the sequence, this gospel, and there have been eyewitnesses. I really like the fact that you've entitled our session tonight, The Eyewitnesses, because Luke mentions that there were eyewitnesses who saw these things from the beginning. Then he also mentions those who had written sources. So Luke is referring to earlier teachings. Now, some scholars who ascribe to the more popular, widely known theory of the description of the synoptic problem as the 2-document hypothesis see Mark as one of Luke's sources, and a hypothetical document that we create from taking parts of Luke and Matthew that don't appear in Mark, putting them together. And that second document in the 2-document hypothesis is called Q, that is from the German word Quelle, meaning sayings. Well, in the Jerusalem School, as we begin to study this 2-document hypothesis, we found so many difficulties, so many shortcomings. Bob Lindsay, who translated the gospel from Greek into Hebrew, felt like that when he's translating, he discovers these Semitisms, words that aren't so much fluent, easy to say in Greek, but they have a Hebrew or an Aramaic version. I'm kind of convinced of the Hebrew hypothesis. For one thing, we have so many Hebrew documents from the Second Temple period, and also having translated many of the documents from the Synoptic Gospels from Greek into Hebrew. I think there are some texts that don't translate very well into Aramaic, but have a greater meaning in Hebrew. We know that the Jewish people revered the holy language, Lashon HaKodesh, Hebrew. And so when we go to the Second Temple period, we have many, many documents, the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, the Book of Jubilees, Sirach ben Sirah, that were preserved in Greek. And now, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, even documents that we found at the Cairo Geniza, we have discovered a Hebrew original for some of these documents we only knew in Hebrew, in Greek, or other translations. And so we're beginning to get this picture in Second Temple period Judaism that they were using Hebrew documents. So when we have the Hebrew or evangelion, we can see, it would only be likely that the early disciples of Jesus would have written a gospel in Hebrew. My friend, a great scholar in Jerusalem, Malcolm Lowe, suggested that the civil war between Antipas and Aretas, maybe about 39 or 40 AD, would have been a great occasion for the disciples of Jesus to say, we have to take what we know from oral tradition And we see references to the oral tradition also in the epistles of Paul. Chapter 15, he says, I delivered to you also what I received. Now, in Pharisaic terminology, we know from Pirkei Avot and other sources from either proto-Pharisees or the early rabbinic movement that it was forbidden to write down many teachings. They were committed to memory, and memory means it's written in a book, a memory of book. You don't change the memorized text, just like you don't change the written text, but you passed it down from master to teacher, and they developed very good systems of how to memorize and pass it down. I would say even today in the Middle East and the Muslim tradition, there are many that memorize the Quran, and in Jewish yeshivot, that is academies of learning, the Bible, the Talmud, the Midrash, the Jewish tradition, the Kabbalah, they practice memorization. And when you read these texts, you do memorize them, you learn them very well, and you can pass them down. So we have the Hebrew or evangelion, which we think originated in oral tradition, but was written down at some place very early. And then from the Papiast tradition and a lot of patristic witnesses. Recently, James Edwards wrote a book on the Hebrew gospel, and he cites 13 different witnesses from the Greek fathers, leaders of the early church that talked about a Hebrew gospel of Jesus, which was translated into Greek, from Greek into Hebrew. And so the Papiast tradition is probably the best known, that Matthew wrote the events of Jesus' life. Teologia, which some people translate exclusively as the sayings, but I think we have to realize, well, teologia can mean events, happenings, sayings, and even in the miracle stories of Jesus' life and teachings, for instance, there's a very important pronouncement or teaching that he's giving in these miracle stories. And so we have these events going from Hebrew, a Hebrew text, some from oral tradition, written tradition, being translated literally into Greek. And then we see this tradition being preserved in different ways in other sources. One we call kind of the reorganized text, maybe a shortened text. There was probably reasons to shorten a text to some degree. And so what we see in Luke, and especially in Matthew, we see connections to this Hebrew gospel. We also believe that through its literal Greek translation, through these sources. And Luke used both this more literal translation from the Hebrew gospel, the first one that we have, which is the reorganized source text, and then we have the first reconstruction. So the first reconstruction was sometimes less complete. You know, the wording is a little bit adapted for a Greek audience sometimes. And so what we have is, when we look at the double tradition, that is texts that are in Luke and Matthew only, one of the good examples of this would be for those that might have a Bible, or if they use a synopsis, if you look at John's preaching of repentance, it's in Luke 3:7-9, Matthew 3:7-10. And here we see a very similarity in wording, almost exactly the same. Why is that? Was Luke copying Mark or Matthew copying Luke? We think that both of them were going back to the reorganized source text, and they are copying it very literally. And Mark doesn't have that. So where Mark is out of the picture, Luke and Matthew agree very strongly on some texts. There are some other texts. One example that we know pretty closely is the Lord's Prayer, for instance, where Matthew's version is a little more longer. I would say it's more Hebraic. And again, I would caution you, sometimes if you use your, some translations, they may be based more on the Byzantine text, and then Matthew and Luke are more similar in their translation of the Lord's Prayer, but especially if you're using the NIV or some of the NRSV or the RSV, the NASB, these are very good translations. I really like the NASB. Now we have the ESV, that's the New American Standard Bible translation, or the English Standard Translation of the Bible. These are what we call more word equivalent literal translations. But there you would see that Luke's text has Father, and for instance, forgive us our sins instead of forgive us our debtors. And Matthew, I think, has our Father who art in heaven, which is a much better Hebraic opening. We have a lot more examples of prayers like this that are, it's a disciples' prayer. It's something you pray together. It's your identity. And he uses the word debts, which is a word that refers to sins. It can be a financial debt, but it can also be a spiritual debt, an offense. And it's probably closer to the type of terminology that we believe would reflect the language that Jesus would have used, the prayer language of Second Temple period Judaism. And, there are scholars that debate this. Joachim Jeremias was a great scholar. He preferred Luke's version and had some things. And they're both very good versions. And, of course, people say, well, maybe he taught it differently at different times. What we see, though, is that when we compare these texts, there's a high verbal identity. They agree in a lot of texts completely in the wording. And, if they have the exact wording, you'd think, well, either they're copying from each other or copying from a common source. The fact that they have a disparity of wording in a lot of cases makes us think that, well, they're probably copying a common source and may adapting a little bit for their communities. So this is what we call the synoptic problem. That is, when you read the Gospels together, there are times that they agree, there are times that they disagree, there are agreements in order, there's agreements in wording. But I think one of the aspects of the Jerusalem school, which you're asking specifically, is that in the 1980s, late 1980s, a group of scholars, there were originally 8 of them. I was one of the original 8 that joined with one of the prominent leaders, of course, was David Bibbin, Robert Lindsay, Shmuel Safrai, David Flusser, Halvorani. Many probably might be familiar with Dwight Pryor. But, Jerusalem School it's a school of thought in Jerusalem. It's not like a bricks and mortars building, but it's a school of thought which has flourished. And I wrote my book, Jesus and His Jewish Parables, using this stemma that we developed. I follow it in my studies of the life and teachings of Jesus to understand the sources behind the Gospels. One of the key factors in the source that I think is really important is to see this linguistic understanding, because when you just read the Gospels in Greek or you're studying them in English, you just feel like, well, what sounds good? What do you think is better or something? But when you have a linguistic analysis, you can read a book that was translated from French into English. If you're very fluent in both languages and you know French as well as English, you will probably be seeing French idioms, French thought, French culture, and you'll have a better grasp of the book. And we can say this for a lot of literature, but it's very easy when we look at the Gospels, because they had a tendency to give a wooden translation, if you want to say that, more literal translation. And we also have the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, the Septuagint, which happened maybe 200, 250 BCE. And so this is a great help to us gospel scholars who are trying to study the Hebrew background of the life and teachings of Jesus, because the Septuagint gives you some guidelines. Now, one of the big problems we have with this is what kind of Hebrew was Jesus speaking, or what kind of Hebrew would be in the Gospels. Today we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which helps a lot. I think we also have what we call Mishnaic Hebrew, which is very helpful. Comes probably dated, really is flourishing a little bit later. Certainly it has very early roots, I believe, from the time of Jesus. We also have what later biblical Hebrew, probably not all of the biblical Hebrew would be completely relevant to the spoken Hebrew or the way they were writing Hebrew in the time of Jesus. But the Jewish people loved the scriptures. They studied them. And when we get to the books that were written later biblical Hebrew, and some books from the intertestamental period, I don't know, the intertestamental period is not always the best terminology. Sometimes we call it, talk about the books more specifically, like the pseudepigrapha or the apocrypha. But let's think about the book Sirach. In Hebrew, we call it Ben Sira, sapiential text, wisdom book. And we can date it pretty clearly, because of the way that we have an introduction in the book. And so it's before the time of Jesus, 100 years approximately. And we have a Greek translation. We have other translations in other languages, but then we've also discovered Hebrew fragments of it. Hebrew parts of it were discovered in the Cairo Geniza and also in Masada. So it kind of comes from the Dead Sea Scrolls that we're getting a little bit of the Hebrew, what I would call later biblical Hebrew. And then when we go into Mishnaic Hebrew, we have texts that deal with the interpretation of scripture, Midrash, the Mechilta, which is a early Bible commentary, exegetical, following along on the book of Exodus. Sifrei Dvarim, a very important text, a commentary that's following along the book of Deuteronomy. These books are rich in parables, the Midrash, and this will be a part of Mishnaic Hebrew. Now, when we go to the Mishnah itself, this quintessential collection of legal lore and life, we have books that have more agat, like the Pirkei Avot at the end of the tractates, the division of Nezakim, that is damages. We have this book that has a little bit more parables, but a lot of the Mishnah is dealing with how do you observe the Sabbath, how do you observe Passover, the holidays, agriculture, a lot of different laws, 6 tractates, approximately 66 divisions, 6 divisions, and approximately 63, way some people count 66 books, minor tractates. The tractate on Sabbath, for instance, gives you 39 of the guidelines of how you should observe the Sabbath, 39 different types of work that defines work for you. So the oral tradition of the Mishnah is defining it, but it's a little more halachic, legalistic. It does help us understand the language, but sometimes I think these other texts, like the Midrashim, Midrashei Halacha, we call them, give you some more insight. This gets very interesting when we begin to see the Greek text, and we can put it into more biblical Hebrew. We can put it more into Mishnaic Hebrew. We might see elements of the writings of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's a little complicated because many of the books were well known. We have fragments of Enoch, which was well known outside the Dead Sea Scrolls, the testaments of the 12 patriarchs, the Book of Jubilees. But then there were what we call sectarian documents that was just used by the sect itself. At least we didn't have knowledge of these books outlines, like what we call the Manual of Discipline. That was the guide to the community. I think one of these scrolls that is extremely important for the discussion we're having now, maybe the type of Hebrew the Hebrew or evangelion had, is the one that we call MMT, based on its Hebrew name that's is Miksat Masei Torah. They say, and that is just a phrase we find in Galatians even, a summary of the works of the law, the works of the law. And it was a letter written, we believe, from the founder of the Dead Sea community to the leader of the Pharisees. And because it's a letter and it's arguing different points of Jewish life, faith, practice, guidelines, halakhic elements, and using somewhat midrashic elements, interpretation of scriptures. I really think, and I wrote about this in my book, Paul the Jewish Theologian, that there are strong elements in this letter that connect with some of Paul's letters, which were written in a similar purpose, trying to show how to apply your faith in your community and different problems. And also Paul's using some similar midrashic points, especially when we go to Romans chapter 4, when we say that Abraham believed God, it was accounted unto him as righteousness. The same text is used in MMT, Miksat Masei Torah, urging the recipients of his letter to accept his viewpoint. And it'll be good for you. It'll be a blessing in this life, the next life. It's very, very poignant. But it's and more of a letter, epistle, an outreach style of writing. So I think in a way we see kind of a living dialect here. Today there's a tendency among some scholars, and we have some great Hebrew scholars that are studying the scrolls and analyzing the language, but they sometimes want to say, well, this is just, a language that was kind of a sectarian, isolated group. And, there's some arguments for that point, but I think any living voice in Hebrew from this time, especially when we study it in relationship to later biblical Hebrew, Mishnaic Hebrew, may shed some valuable light on this language. It's not such a big issue in a lot of ways. For instance, just let me give you a couple of examples. In biblical Hebrew, we use the word to take lakach, and in Mishnaic Hebrew, you use the word lintol, natal, natal. And so we have the same Jesus. If you are trying to get the speck out of your brother's eye a little later, when you've got a beam in your eye, first take the beam out of your eye. I think this was probably a humorous saying of Jesus. We have a parallel saying in the Mishnaic Hebrew, and instead of saying kach, lakach, using the three-letter lakach, kach, take this speck out of your own eye first, they use the Hebrew word natal, tol. That would be the imperative. Tol, kisam mi bein einecha. You've got to take the speck out of your own eye before you try it. So, at any rate, these are just maybe a little bit of a different way of expressing yourself. In biblical Hebrew, we have the word sim, which is to put, used frequently. More frequently in Mishnaic Hebrew, the other Hebrew word is hiniach, lahaniach. So, it might be a little different wording, but, the Hebraic syntax and many of the other features are very easy to see there. And I think what's very interesting is that sometimes we have some very close parallels between the Mishnaic Hebrew and some of the discussions there, where the context in Jewish culture, the thinking of the thought of the leaders and the debate, and you can kind of get a bigger idea of what's going on. One of them I think is very interesting is the Sabbath controversy, where Jesus says the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. And so, what are we saying here? I think it's really, if we get in the context, literally, Genesis chapter 1, the whole world was created, and then God created the Sabbath and invited man to celebrate the Sabbath with him. And I think Jesus actually is alluding to that in his teaching, where he uses the word, the Sabbath was made. It came into being because of God's creative activity. Now, we have a very close parallel to this in Mishnah Hebrew. Shimon ben Menashe, a Tanaitic scholar, one of the earlier scholars, not maybe within 100 years of Jesus' teachings, and he says, the Sabbath was delivered over to you, and you were not delivered over to the Sabbath. In other words, he uses the terminology, Shabbat Masorah Lechem. Masorah, Masar, is a tradition that you're passing on. So he said, well, this is a tradition that was passed down to us from the scriptures, from the 10 Commandments, from, you must remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And it was delivered to you for a blessing. And you weren't delivered over to it, that the Sabbath would be onerous and cause you grief. Isaiah the prophet said the Sabbath should be an oneg, a delight. So here we have two examples of sayings, very similar. And while Jesus' saying is preserved in Greek, I think we would probably understand it even better if we would look behind it to the Hebrew linguistic background behind it. And even a parallel with Shimon ben Menashe, we see this love for the Sabbath and the way that you're interpreting the Sabbath to make it more meaningful in your culture, in your family, your life, and in practical application. But as we look at this greater stemma of how the Gospels came to us, it becomes clearer, I think, that we've got the Hebrew evangelium, we have this literal translation, we have this first reorganized text. We think in that reorganization, there may have been some disruption in the sequence. And that's one reason why Luke says, I want to understand each event, how they relate to one another. I think the sequence is more how the one event may be interconnected with the next event as it's unfolding. And the three writers of the Synoptic Gospels have a way to creatively present their understanding of Jesus and his life is unfolding. They have a little bit of similarities and of course, a little bit of differences. But we can put together the life of Jesus. John's Gospel is also, I think, important, of course, very important when we're studying the life of Jesus, but it's not the same genre, if you will, in the sense of the Synoptic Gospels. It's a little more theological and less biographical, but it has a lot of biography and some stories that don't appear in the Gospels. I think we also see some evidence that John was familiar with some of the sources, the Synoptic Gospels, being written probably after the Synoptic Gospels. But we're talking primarily about the stemma and how the first three Gospels were written. So what we find is that Matthew and Luke often agree very similarly when they're connected to the reorganized text. They may be different if Luke is copying from the second reconstruction and Matthew is relying on Luke's other source. And so we have some texts like that. The Lord's Prayer is an example where the wording is quite a bit different. But when we come to Mark, Mark is the influencer of Matthew. It seems like Matthew copied from Mark's text, gave it a high degree of credibility. And when we have a text from the triple tradition, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what we find is many times Matthew is relying and using Mark, accepting his wording more, whereas Luke is more independent of Mark, and he's using this first reconstruction, this primary source for the life and teachings of Jesus. And we see a little bit more of the Hebraic covenant. And it seems like Mark was one that kind of expanded his sources in some ways. We could talk about him as being the shortest in length, but sometimes his parallels are longer than Luke, and sometimes his expansions also impact Mark. But it's when we have what we call the Mark and cross factor, that is, Mark is a mediator between Matthew and Luke. It shows you how Luke is more independent of Matthew, and Matthew is using Mark. So this is a stemma that helps us understand how the Synoptic Gospels interrelate with one another. Now, we have the Jerusalem Perspective website, very good website. I think you can go there and see a lot of the articles from some of those who have participated in events for the Jerusalem School, written articles. Jack Poirier, a student who studied with me in our Judeo-Christian Studies program, he at the Graduate School of Theology and Ministry at Oral Roberts University, he graduated, went on to Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, in Manhattan, and completed his doctoral work there. He wrote several articles in the Jerusalem Perspective about Lukan priority, and other scholars who suggested Lukan priority before Lindsay kind of really pioneered this work and this understanding. And of course, David Flusser wrote many articles about the life and teachings of Jesus. His first major book, I think it was published in 1967, which was in a kind of a pocket edition of the life of Jesus in this very prestigious series in Germany, where they would have different figures, historical figures. And this Taschenbuch, this pocketbook series on the life of Jesus, was written by David Flusser, a Jewish scholar from Hebrew University, a Jewish perspective, an Orthodox Jewish perspective, and it was very powerful. When he wrote that book, actually, he had not really entered into some of the discussions with Lindsay about, the interconnection between the Synoptic Gospels. And probably at that time, both Lindsay and Flusser would have been following the traditional theory of the two document hypothesis and Mark and the priority, because that is, so ingrained in scholarship today that sometimes their scholars just aren't interested in considering another theory. But when he updated that book later, and there was a very good English edition updated with R. Stephen Notley as editor. Of course, that book is really following the approach of Lukan priority. And I know in many of Flusser's writings, especially one of his books in Hebrew that was published, Yahadut Makarot HaNatzrut, Judaism and the Sources of Christianity, edited by Chana Safrai, the daughter of Shmuel Safrai, that he talked about the synoptic problem and emphasized Lukan priority. So I would say, as the Jerusalem School became larger, there's different viewpoints. Not everybody probably just follows Lukan priority. Look, at the very beginning, there was this desire to really help people understand Lukan priority, because it's not really very well understood outside Jerusalem. Outside, some of these scholars are working very closely with one another on the life of Jesus, trying to understand the text of the Synoptic Gospels more. And so we wanted to expand the story. I think also that many scholars today accept the Aramaic theory, and the Hebrew theory is widely supported by the evidence and the way that we're reading the Gospels in the life of Jesus. So, I think it's kind of wrong, to think that there was only one language being spoken at the time of Jesus in the land of Israel, Judea. Talk about Galilee. In America, people say, "What language do you speak?" But Well, in many countries of the world, you would say, which languages do you speak? And probably in Israel, Greek and Aramaic and Hebrew would have been spoken widely to the east. Aramaic would have been spoken in Iraq, was today Iraq, Babylon. But I think there's a lot of evidence, not just the Dead Sea Scrolls, but inscriptional evidence that would show that that Hebrew was being used. We have a Theodosius inscription that was discovered, I think, in 1917, describing a synagogue. Beautiful Greek inscription. I mean, obviously, in the book of Acts, it talks about those who were speaking Greek and those that were Hebraic. Now, I know this is in debate among New Testament scholars. When it says Hebraisti, we believe, I believe that they're talking about Hebrew, but some scholars want to argue that Hebraisti is really another reference to Aramaic. But we have Suristi, which is used in Aramaic in Hebrew. And Greek of the time, Suristi was the name for the Aramaic language. And so, there's two different names. And while there's strong similarities between Hebrew and Aramaic, they're very different languages. And sometimes we see them distinguished by their vocabulary, syntax, and we can see different reasons why we would use it that way. But I hope that this just kind of brief overview of the stemma can give you an idea. There's a lot on that stemma because we end with Matthew, the final gospel. Then we go to Mark, who's the intermediary with Matthew. Then we go to Luke. Luke is the one that's very much connected to this Greek literal translation, reorganized text. He's also influenced by this verse reconstruction that we have. But the primary sources, as we go back to a literal Greek and then a Hebrew evangelium, I think we can see very clearly the Hebrew evangelium many times as we're studying the Synoptic Gospels. And of course, there is editing, there's development in different ways or another. We see it being guided by the Holy Spirit as Christians, we believe, of course, that it's being guided by the Lord, by the Spirit, to help people understand the life and teachings of Jesus in a better way. And the community that Luke was communicating to, Mark was communicating to, Matthew was communicating to. So as we study them together, we get a very clear picture of Jesus' life. I think one of the best things about the Jerusalem School is the way that we honor all three Gospels. We don't look at Mark as the only reliable gospel. In fact, probably in our approach, Mark would be less historical than Matthew and Luke, because Matthew and Luke are a little closer to the Hebrew gospel. But we would see all three gospels as having great importance in studying the life and teachings of Jesus. It also helps you see that, I can see why some scholars would naturally gravitate to Matthew, like W.R. Farmer yesteryear, a few years ago, back now, but he championed the idea of Matthean priority. And that was the approach of the early church fathers, maybe because it was used more in liturgy, prayer, gospel readings as the first in sequence. But, since the modern period, the 19th century especially, German higher criticism has pretty much pushed the idea of Markan priority. It's been accepted in Britain and across the pond in America. And so you come from Jerusalem, you come from a different school of thought, a different background, studying the Gospels in the land. And in Hebrew, almost all of our studies was conducted in modern Hebrew, and all of our studies were conducted with the Greek text, not so much reliant on translations into Greek. And I do think there's a lot of value just studying the Gospels in Greek, using modern Hebrew as a medium of discussion and debate to understand the life of Jesus better. And I think it gives you a little bit more perception. But I hope that helps a little bit, Jacob, with the questions that you're asking. And if people get the book, Jesus, the Jewish Theologian, they can see more examples in how this unfolds.
I want to go back to Robert Lindsay's Greek translation of Mark into Hebrew. Now, when he did this, did he say that did he identify the Hebrew version of Mark as being the Hebrew gospel, or did he say that this was a Proto-Mark written in Hebrew and it's distinct from the Hebrew gospel or the Hebrew evangelium?
Oh, that's a very good question, Jacob. And you're also bringing up terminology that's often used by scholars, what they call a proto-mark. And so that's one way they try to explain some problems of the Synoptic Gospels, that maybe they had a different version of Mark. I really kind of reject the idea of a proto-mark, and I don't think it's a good approach. It's an easy out. I think the Jerusalem School approach is much better. But when Lindsay was translating the Gospels, the Gospel of Mark, and I think originally he was going to translate the whole New Testament, he never completed that. But as he was translating the Gospel of Mark from Greek into modern Hebrew, he was seeing what a lot of linguists have been saying for many, many years, that there's Semitic undertext. Some would say Aramaic, others argued for Hebrew, but I think even today, probably a strong consensus of gospel scholars, New Testament scholars, would say there are some Semitic roots, Semitic background to many of the sayings of Jesus. And they may go emphasize it a little bit more, a little bit less, but this is something that's widely recognized and discussed. Lindsay saw this when he's translating, but what surprised him was that Mark seemed to stylize a little bit more in Greek. Now, Lindsay was really trained in classical Greek, was very competent as a linguist, grammarian. I think as a translator, he excelled. Some people may know that I've worked on a translation of the New Testament. We've published it, the Hebrew Heritage Bible, Newer Testament, and you can see the Hebrew Heritage Bible, Newer Testament on our website, HebrewHeritageBible.com. And I would say that Dr. Lindsay had a great influence on me, working as I had the opportunity to work with him for many years on an approach to translation. Our goal was to hear as they heard, to try to translate it in a way from Greek into English, not just with 2 steps, Greek and English, but to have this intermediate step where we would say, from Greek, we would say, what did this mean in Hebrew? What was the context in Jewish faith and practice? And then after we really understand the Hebrew with the Greek, we would translate it with the functional equivalency that would kind of give you the sense, well, this is how people would hear it. And that way we could bring out the meaning of the idioms. And I think, it's been out now since 21. We've had a lot of very good response to it. I think it's helped people understand the Jewish roots of our Christian faith and the sayings of Jesus. And of course, there's a lot of Jewish faith and practice in the book of Revelation or in the epistles of Paul. I also am strongly drawn to the theory of Thompson, who thought like the book of Revelation probably had a Hebrew original and maybe translation Greek. Of course, it has many quotations from the Hebrew scriptures as well that, gives it that Hebraic flow. But the whole book really, and we'll you can see that in the translation work. But Lindsay would just see elements in Mark that was more clearly Greek. Yeah, one thing I thought was very interesting in the Great Confession of Jesus in Matthew chapter 16, Luke chapter 9. It's also paralleled in Mark's version in Mark chapter 8, where Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do the men say that I am?" Now, in Mark's gospel, it's very simple. Who do the people say that I am? In the parallel in Matthew, it's different. He says, "Who do they say that the Son of Man is?" And Luke, I think, is a little more like Mark in this case. Who do the people? He doesn't say that the crowds, but it says the people. Who are the people? Who do they say that I am? And we have three different versions. One part that I think is very interesting is that Luke 9, verse 19, closes with, "One of the old prophets has arisen," at the conclusion. Matthew actually adds a reference to Jeremiah. And Mark, in this case, is shorter. He just says John the Baptist and Elijah, or one of the prophets. But I think that if we would look at both Matthew and Luke, that probably their wording is not just arbitrary, but it connects to a Hebraic understanding and this source. When you say one of the prophets has arisen, I remember in our class studying this, and David Flusser, I hadn't thought about it before. Probably it's in, several commentaries I think you would find. It doesn't seem like it would be that hard, but Flusser brought it out. And it was important to him. He says, this is reminding you of Deuteronomy 18. I think it's Deuteronomy also, Deuteronomy 32, but he says, "From the midst of your brethren, I will raise up a prophet like unto you." In this case, historical context is Moses saying a prophet like unto you would be Joshua. But in the popular messianic thought of Second Temple period Judaism, who were expecting a restoration of the Davidic kingdom in some way, or a messianic movement, they felt like a prophet like Moses would be the one who would lead the redemption. So I think there's one stream of messianic thought that was maybe a little more connected to Moses even than would have been connected to David. Also, here where we have Jeremiah. I mean, Jeremiah in Matthew's version was one of the final prophets during the days of the first temple, and he spoke about the utensils of the temple, other things. I mean, there may be something in larger messianic thought that would see, well, Jeremiah would help with the restoration of the worship and temple worship. We don't know. I mean, but both of these things are very interesting. But to me, the fact that Luke has this phraseology, "I will raise up a prophet," well, this would be something important. And maybe Mark didn't feel like that would be understood. Maybe he didn't understand it that way, but he makes it a little more concise and to the point for non-Jewish readers. And so in the church tradition, we often associate Mark as connected with Peter's preaching in Rome and a gospel that might have been more appropriate for non-Jews. He certainly emphasizes the action in Jesus' life and minimizes the teaching, whereas Matthew's gospel, because he emphasizes the teaching, also scriptural fulfillment is a characteristic that we see in Matthew, that some of the Judaic origins and emphases come out in Matthew's gospel much clearer. Well, Lindsay is seeing this as he's translating Mark just from a linguistic point of view. And sometimes he found that Luke was more Hebraic, especially in these texts that seem to be very much connected to our reorganized literal translation from the evangelium. So Lindsay published this, and it was in a book called An Introduction to the Translation. But he had a long introduction to the synoptic problem in that book. He also had a very important introduction, which was written by David Flusser, who was accepting this theory, following this research, and they were collaborating together. It was kind of a really unusual makeup, the fact that you had Bob Lindsay, who was more of an evangelical scholar, but here you had an Orthodox Jewish scholar, and they were in Jerusalem, both of them speaking modern Hebrew, studying the life of Jesus in Greek together, and really paving a new way, breaking ground in a revolutionary approach to the synoptic problem that would highlight the Jewish Jesus more accurately. And you have to understand there is a method, there is an approach. I know David Flusser, I don't know, sometimes if he's entirely serious, but he didn't like using the word methodology. He says methodology, once you get a methodology, it's going to force you to make mistakes. You have to have an approach, but you have to be independent in the way that you're applying it. You have to study each text. One of the things that Lindsay and Flusser emphasized was the text. One thing I think that many reading the scriptures today, or they're sometimes they're asking the wrong questions, or they're trying to maybe make the text say something that flows with some of their personal viewpoints or theologies. And one of the things I really valued about David Flusser is he would always say, Ma Yeshu Rotzeh Lomar. What does Jesus want to say? What is Jesus really teaching us here? And he seemed to bravely, without any apologetic intent, wanted to study the Gospels. He said, we're not being fair to Jesus. We're trying to tame Jesus. Jesus had some very strong sayings, call to discipleship, radical reform, or wanted reform, restoration of the foundation of Torah learning, really focusing on the kingdom of heaven message as he understood it. And of course, he's very close to many of the rabbis of the time and teachers. I think we see even in the Mishnah period, there are a lot of similarities with the approach to the kingdom of God. The kingdom of heaven is a major theme in early Tanaitic writings and can help us understand the life and teachings of Jesus. Probably in modern scholarship, there's more a tendency to try to look at the eschatological, apocalyptic writings from the Second Temple of Earth, which of course are extremely important. We need to examine all of the evidence, but I think that Jesus is closer to the Tanaitic literature, but he's also giving it a new dynamic, a new force of emphasizing forgiveness, radical forgiveness, love even your enemies, a really strong approach that love is a force, forgiveness is a force. This is the force of God's kingdom, bringing healing to hurting people, healing of the soul, healing of the body. Jesus is very dynamic in his application of the kingdom message. And he is also focused on an eschatological event, the coming of the Son of Man. But I think sometimes we have made the coming of the Son of Man identical with the kingdom message. I think it was Albert Schweitzer, when he was writing in German, that said the coming of the Son of Man, the kingdom of God are identisch. They're identical. And I imagine that if we really pulled them apart, I think they're two major things, and they overlap. They certainly overlap at some point, because the kingdom will be established ultimately in the end of time in the scenario. And in the way that Jesus portrayed the teachings and proclaimed the coming of the Son of Man and the final judgment and the preparations. There are two ways. You have to make the choice. You want to choose the narrow path, the narrow gate, and follow the narrow way that leads to life everlasting. And so Jesus, was strong in lifting this ethical, moral, I would call it very much ethical monotheism. Love God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself. And we see these elements flowing through the life and teachings of Jesus, which are connected to the kingdom theme. But this is the way that Lindsay began to work on this. And, it surprised him. I mean, he really believed in marking priority. And I would say that's the way David Flusser wrote his, one of his very popular books. David Flusser wrote some very good books. I was privileged to edit one book that he wrote, Judaism and the Origins of Christianity. It's about 750 pages. It was several years in the making, collected some articles that he'd already written, but we were editing them and editing new studies. And I don't know, he was really enjoying writing this book. He was very creative. He was very original. He was very focused, like a laser beam, on bringing out these teachings from the life of Jesus and the connections with the larger Jewish context. I think that's, maybe the best book Flusser wrote. I know he really loved that book. He also wrote some very good books in German. Recently, some of his books were translated from Hebrew into English that are with Ehrman's press, some very good books that you can read by David Flusser. I highly recommend his work to you. And of course, there's some books that he wrote in Hebrew that weren't translated, and other books he wrote in German that aren't translated either. And perhaps they will be able to translate them. Recently, his book on the parables that was written in German has now appeared in English recently. So you really want to get that parables book if you can, that David Flusser wrote.
And in my final question, when do you think the Gospels were written? When do you date the Gospels?
Well, it is interesting that David Flusser make a comment that probably wouldn't always be accepted. I always remember one comment he made, there's nothing in the Synoptic Gospels that would say they're dated after 70. That is the destruction of Jerusalem. Once Jerusalem was destroyed, it was something you just had to, somehow refer to when you're writing a book. It was such a catastrophe in Jewish faith and practice. There are, within the gospel text, having said that, you have to see some prophetic elements that Jesus warned against the destruction of the temple. Flusser felt like that these were very much, these weren't written ex eventu, after the event, but they were written with a prophetic awareness. Like Josephus speaks about, the historian Josephus from this period speaks about some others who prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem. One article by C.H. Dodd, I think, was very interesting, that he quoted Ezekiel, who talked about siege works going around Jerusalem and Jerusalem being destroyed, the prophet Ezekiel. And Jesus refers specifically to Ezekiel, warning, if you don't repent and turn to the Lord, Jerusalem will be destroyed. He was prophesying that. So, Flusser says, if you're going to accept the argument of some of the scholars that any kind of reference to the destruction of Jerusalem has to flow from the prophecy after the event. He said, well, using that terminology, you can read Ezekiel and say that Ezekiel was written after 70 AD, which obviously nobody would claim that, since he's an exilic prophet, so, but, I think Flusser's point makes a good point. We have a reference in the parables, the king will come and destroy this place. I mean, some people, I don't know if Flusser might have thought that that was a later interpolation maybe, or it's just, again, a way you would describe the destruction of Jerusalem. But he says there's nothing in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that would cause you to date it after 70 CE. Now, I think it would be better to consider some of the things that Malcolm Lowe was saying, that how early are these references to the Hebrew gospel? I mean, Paul seems to be quoting from it. We also see that Paul made reference to what many scholars today call the pre-Christian hymns, or not pre-Christian hymns, but pre-Pauline hymns in his letters. Sometimes it will start with the relative pronoun who, and then it will give you an affirmation of faith in Jesus, and could have been a song or worship. Paul made reference to this. He made reference to some other sources. So I would date the Synoptic Gospels before the destruction of the temple, maybe closer. Their final compilation, as we see them today, probably close to that time. But I would say the sources could go back to 40. We wonder, well, what was the first book of the New Testament? In some ways, I date Galatians before the Jerusalem Council, which we know from the famine and other things, we date probably to 49 CE, 49 AD, and maybe 48. The Epistle of James, for instance, there's really nothing in the Epistle of James to help us date it. There's no reference to the destruction of Jerusalem. Paul doesn't make any reference to the destruction of Jerusalem. He's saying in his letters, I've got to go to Jerusalem to celebrate the festival in the temple. And we see this in the book of Acts as well. Of course, the Acts is not Paul's own writings, but again, are we seeing something that's later? I still think the argument that if Acts was written after the martyrdom of Paul, Luke would have had to talk about that. He talks about the martyrdom of Stephen. So I'm one of these that tends to date the New Testament earlier. There was a time, I guess we'd call it maybe the Tübingen school, that was highly skeptic of the earlier dates of the Newer Testament, and often challenged traditional authorship. I think we have to really study the authorship issue very closely and understand the evidence as best we can. I don't see evidence that the Apostle Paul wrote the book of Hebrews. I don't really know who wrote the book of Hebrews, but we can think of some really great scholars like John H.G. Robertson, who was saying that redating the New Testament, that maybe all of the documents are before 70. I think there's some, evidence maybe that John's gospel could be afterwards, that the book of Revelation is closer to the time of Domitian, but definitely the Synoptic Gospels, they really fit in that period. And I see them having their moral ethical teachings being close to some of the Medrashay Halakha, but we see Midrash, we see Agadah, we see Halakha. The parables of Jesus are certainly so masterful, and the message, 1/3 of everything Jesus said was in parables. It's just so powerful the way that he taught in parables. So I think today, actually, there's, I could be wrong. Some people will give a different analysis, but I think today in modern New Testament scholarship, there's more of a consensus leaning towards earlier dates rather than later dates. I think the later dates, 125 for Matthew's gospel. I mean, I don't think very many people are, going to die on that hill that Matthew's written in 125, but, some will say, well, a few years after the destruction of the temple, 85, 80, we have some dating like that. But I think this dating issue is really important. But I think the sources of the Synoptic Gospels are also very important. We have probably a Hebrew source that's widely attested in patristic literature, and we see it in the Synoptic Gospels. I mean, it's not like it's hidden. It's there. If you know Greek, you know Hebrew, and you study these things linguistically, you see the Hebrew Gospel there. And you would say, well, this could be within 10 years of Jesus' life. We don't know. We don't have the full evidence, but when we see Luke referring to the eyewitnesses and also talking about written sources, and we see different sources. In our stemma, we don't talk about Luke's unique sources. He has some sources that are just that only he used, especially the first 2 chapters, which show a lot about Mary, the Blessed. And then we also see Matthew has some unique sources. So those are also aspects. When do we date them? And but I think today there's more of a sense that some of these documents are earlier. I think also even in dating the life of the Apostle Paul, which, there's a lot of debate among very good historians and give and take on some of the issues. But to me, that there's an openness to date the rise of the New Testament a little bit earlier. And I consider myself, I'm an evidence-based critical thinker. I want to see the evidence. The most important thing is to get the evidence and analyze it fairly accurately. And then with critical thinking, you can apply it and try to piece together the history. And sadly, sometimes we're just trying to fit in with a scholar, a certain approach, rather than literally interpreting the evidence the best that we know. And I think probably we would say we'd probably be wanting to date the Gospels a little earlier rather than later in that regard.
I'd like to remind everybody of the links to purchase Brad Young's books will be in the description below and the pinned comment. Link to the Jerusalem School website will also be provided in the description below as well. And with that being said, Brad, thank you for joining me tonight.
Thank you, Jacob. It's great to be with you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.